Hey, I'm Ben Avery. This is Strangers and Aliens, pulp science fiction. And for this episode, we are talking about a series of books that is one of the most interesting and unique anthology concepts that I've ever come across. I've been wanting to talk about this since the beginning of starting to talk about science fiction books on the YouTube channel here. But it's also a series of books I've been wanting to read for a few decades because I had 3 of the 4 books, but I hadn't tracked down the 4th book yet. I finally got them all. I have them in my hand. I've read them, and I finally get to talk about what I think is one of the coolest anthologies I've ever come across, and that is Roger Elwood's CONTINUUM series. So I said multiple times in the past that I love anthologies, and I absolutely love anthologies with some sort of strange or unique twist to them or a cool theme. I've edited my own anthology, A Time for Everything, which has one of those cool themes. Time travel mixed in with Ecclesiastes 3. 31 amazing writers in here, and me, available on Amazon. Shameless plug. But anyway, I love anthologies. I love the idea of just all these different voices. But the books I'm about to talk about here, it could also have been considered a serialized sci-fi hardcover magazine because it came out regularly, and this has a super unique twist. Now, 1992, 1993, around in there, I think it was 92 though, because at the beginning of my freshman year, I had a person who lived down the hall in the dorm. His name was Dwight, and he mentioned that he was going to go into South Bend, which was, we were in Mishawaka. South Bend is the next city over. You don't even know when you've moved from Mishawaka into South Bend because they just grew together. But he said he's going to go to a place called the Griffin. It's a used bookstore, and they have a lot of science fiction books and gaming books and stuff like that. And I said, well, can I go with you? And so we hopped on the bus. We went to the Griffin, and that was the first time I got to go to that store, and it was not the last. I went there a lot of times. My wife and I, when we were dating, we would go there on dates because one of our dates was we go out for dinner, and then we go to a used bookstore or Barnes & Noble when Barnes & Noble came into town. But it's still there. The Griffin is still there. I don't go there very often. I think it's been a few years since I've been there because lately if I go into South Bend, I'm driving through South Bend to get to the hospital for a hospital visit, and stopping at the used bookstore is not the first thing on my mind as I'm going on a hospital visit for my job as a pastor. But anyway, that was the first time I went to that bookstore, and I couldn't tell you exactly when I bought these books, but I can say it was my freshman year because I remember somewhere between my freshman and sophomore year, I started reading these books. Now, I didn't know what I was buying when I bought them. I bought volumes 1, 2, and 3, and I'm pretty sure it's because I saw them on the shelf lined up like this. 1, 2, 3. They look so uniform. They look so nice on the shelf together like that. I really can't break them up. Also, Roger Elwood? Wait a minute. I know who he is. Roger Elwood was a writer that I was aware of because of This Present Darkness. So This Present Darkness comes out. Frank Peretti. It's angel fiction. It's Christian speculative kind of stuff. And so they were looking for the next big angel thing. And Roger Elwood had his book, Angel Walk. So that's how I became aware of Roger Elwood. And so I see these on the shelf. Now, it was not this edition here. They were paperbacks when I found them. 1, 2, and 3. What I did not realize was I was missing volume 4. This is a 4-volume series. I did not understand that there was 4 volumes, and I did not understand what I was actually picking up. I just thought it was 3 different books, collections of short stories. When I got them home, I'm not sure if I read them in the dorm. I don't think I started reading them because I don't remember actually reading them in the dorm. What I do have vivid memory of is reading them in my house between freshman and sophomore year of college. We lived in that house for just 2 years. I only lived in that house for 1 summer, and so I have a vivid memory of reading these books in that house. But I also remember not finishing them because I realized there was a 4th volume and I didn't have it. And at that point I thought, well, what's the use of continuing to read them until I can find volume 4. Now, somewhere in my move, I have lost these paperback books. They were on my shelf at our old house before we moved here to this house. I don't know where they are. It's been 3 years now we've been living here, 3.5, 4. It doesn't matter how long we've been living here. I have not come across them, and I have looked specifically for them because I wanted to talk about these books for this YouTube channel. Couldn't find them. So what I decided to do was just go on eBay. So I went on eBay, found these 3, found number 4, and you might be wondering why there's Post-it notes sticking out of these. That's because these are signed. Volumes 1, 2, and 3 came from one seller, and they're all signed by Paul Anderson. And I just never took the Post-it note out. So apparently, someone had volumes 1, 2, and 3 and got them signed at a signing, but either wanted to keep volume 4 or didn't get volume 4, like me. Now, I'm not surprised they didn't get volume 4, but we'll talk about volume 4 in a minute. Here's the gimmick, and it's a great gimmick. I love the idea of what he did here. I would love to try and do something myself for another anthology that I edit, but I don't think I'll be able to get to that. But what I love about the gimmick here is that they actually feature 7 different writers who wrote a continuing, well, it's not continuing, it's not supposed to be continuing anyway, but who wrote something in the same world, and they're basically 4 different novellas, short stories that move from book to book to book to book. There is an 8th story in each volume, but that is a different author in each volume. Dean Koontz is the one who did the first one, and he kind of set up the idea, the concept, and then other writers took the concept and ran with it in volume 2, 3, and 4. I love the idea. I love the concept. The stories are by names that I was familiar with and some that I was not. Obviously, Roger Elwood is one, but then there's Philip Jose Farmer, who was a name that I, even back then, was familiar with. Paul Anderson was a name that I did not necessarily know anything he had written, but I had come across that name in my reading things. Chad Oliver, even today, when I was first reading these in the last few months, I didn't know who he was. I had to look him up. Thomas Scorsha, was not aware of who he was. Anne McCaffrey, though, I knew Anne McCaffrey from back then as a college student. Gene Wolfe, a name that I did not know back then, but is actually a writer I have met since then. Edgar Pangborn, was not familiar with him. And then Dean R. Koontz, who I was familiar with. And I'll never forget sitting with Roger Elwood this is where I... did I hit my foot when I dropped that name? Roger Elwood. I was sitting in Red Lobster with Roger Elwood talking about some of the things he had done, and I'll never forget him telling me the story of how he discovered Dean Koontz. Now, I don't remember the story itself, but I will never forget him telling me the story about how he discovered Dean Koontz. Dean Koontz, like I said, wrote one story for this volume, and then it was continued on in volume 2 by Gail Kimberly, and in volume 3 by Pamela Sargent and George Zabrowski. And then in volume 4, the final volume, it was by Barry N. Malsberg. None of those are names I am familiar with at all. Now, here's the thing about Roger Elwood. When I met him, and I think I might have mentioned this before when I was talking about The Wandering, but when I met Roger Elwood and he was kind of talking me through some things, and there's a little bit of a mentorship going on, not too much. We only got together a few times, had a few phone conversations. But when I met him, I did not realize what a wealth of science fiction experience and science fiction knowledge and honestly, just people he knew from the science fiction world. I had no clue. I did not know that he had edited dozens and dozens of anthologies. And if I'm being honest, I probably even forgot that he had worked on this book, even though I knew he had. I mean, that's the reason I picked these up was the name on the spine, Roger Elwood. So here's what you get in these books. Philip Jose Farmer did a cycle of stories called Stations of the Nightmare, which is a fantastic story about a man who gets infected by a UFO. It's a whole weird thing. There's some content things, some sexual things in it, but that's the one I remember grabbing me when I read this in college. I remember reading that and it's kind of an anti-Superman kind of a story where a man gets superpowers and the world is threatened by it. and what does that do, and how does it work, and how can they take him out? And there's another character in there who is a science fiction writer, and there's actually the government turns to the science fiction writer to kind of ask him for some ideas of how do you kill this man who we can't kill, because if anyone tries to harm him, he can't even help himself, protects himself with these super psychic powers. And it's an interesting, fascinating story, and it's 4 chapters. Now, every chapter, you're supposed to be able to pick up any one of these books, and you can read the stories within without having to worry about reading the book before. I wouldn't say it exactly works out that way. Paul Anderson, his stories are kind of almost an analogy of American history in space, as you have these kind of rough and tough settlers, colonizers going and colonizing a planet, and just politically what happens. There's a lot of political stuff in that. There's not a lot of action. In fact, one of my notes that I wrote in my reading journal was it was a good high concept but forgettable. And so that was one that I didn't feel like I wasted time reading it, but it didn't feel like the kind of thing that just really grabbed me. And I don't remember reading it when I had these books in college. The third set of stories is by Chad Oliver, and that is the Caravans Unlimited series. And that one is fascinating. Each of those stories is about traders going to a planet. The first story, called Shaka, is actually kind of a space analogy of what happened with Shaka Zulu. The second one is called Stability, and that was kind of a workaround as far as like a prime directive kind of a thing. It was interesting. It was slightly disturbing, but it gets into some strange worlds. Every world they go to, there's another alien species, and it has like its own background, and he does a great job of world building with that. The third one is called The Middleman, which is another fascinating take on the prime directive. There's a lot of human interest in that one. And this is my note here in my reading journal, is better each chapter, each book. And there's a new mystery that's interesting because they come across a world that was visited by another alien species. But the whole idea is just space is so big and so broad that the human empire and this alien empire have not come across each other yet. And they, as of the fourth story, they still have not come across each other again, just because space is so big. The fourth one is called Monitor, and I thought that was a strong ending, and it gets into the weeds about colonization and about colonization's biggest sin, which he quotes as "Father knows best," as if all other cultures were children. And what's interesting about Chad Oliver is when I looked into him, he was an anthropologist, and so for him to take up this kind of interactions with other planets that are, culturally more primitive, but then asking questions about that, and it does what good science fiction does. Then you have the Armageddon tapes by Thomas Scorsha. I did not like those ones. It's a lot of alien perspective, and it's telling the story with weird dialogue formats and things like that, and it was understandable, but it wasn't enjoyable. And it was barely understandable to me anyway. Anne McCaffrey, this is where her book, I think it's called The Crystal Singer, but this is where her book, The Crystal Singer, came from, is these 4 novellas. She expanded upon them and put them together into a novel. And it was good. It was pretty good. Gene Wolfe's stories were always very, very short. And I've read a couple of Gene Wolfe's novels and enjoyed them, but I was glad that the short stories were very, very short. And it was odd and a little bit confusing. It was basically about how people could, instead of waiting until they died, they could leave their bodies sooner, and it didn't grab me. Edgar Pangborn, his stories were all taking place in a world he had created for a novel series, and none of them were connected as far as characters. They just all took place in this kind of post-apocalyptic world, and they were decent. What was really fun was the one that gets passed on from author to author, and that was about a world where robots had taken over at some point in the past, and now we're the only sentient, or the primary sentient beings on the Earth. There are still animals on the Earth, but humanity had been gone for so long that humanity had passed into myth. And humanity basically took the form of Bigfoot, as it was just something that was talked about in whispers among the robots. And so each one of these stories is about either finding evidence of robots, or of humans rather, or actually coming in contact with humans and a conflict with humans. And it was interesting. It was fun. It was fun to see like all four of these writers kind of take on their own take on the idea, but then it also was pushing forward a slight narrative that went and pushed things forward. It was cool. It was interesting, and I was really glad that I was able to find this fourth volume, because now it's not hard to find these things. eBay, used bookstores websites, Amazon makes it very easy to find these things. But I was so glad I was able to find these, read them, finally finish them, and actually just be able to talk about it with you right now. Now here's the bad thing. I don't think these caught on. I think that he was hoping to go beyond 4 volumes. But these 3 were all published by Putnam and Berkeley. And they were published by another publisher in England, I believe. But the problem is there is a distinct feeling of just a different feel to this 4th volume. First of all, I don't know if you can see here with the reflection on my covers here, but the little shadow behind the words, it's white on these 3, but it's black on this one. And so I don't think that is a quality issue, but I do find it interesting that they all have this white trade dress, and then for this one, it becomes this black shadow behind it. And then in this 4th book, there were typos all over the place. Just all over the place, which I did not notice for these 3. There was problems with typesetting. Quotation marks were pointed in the wrong direction, and words were spelled wrong. And I started actually making a list of all the typos. Page 40, page 54, page 46 or 56, page 71, page 79. The first story had a weird typesetting issue. When H's were supposed to be there, they were replaced by T's. And it just felt less cared for. There was no introduction in this one. These other ones all had introductions. This felt like an obligation. This felt like the publisher said, we bought these 4 volumes from Roger. We're going to go ahead and we're going to print this 4th one so that the people who actually care can get volume 4. But I don't find it to be a surprise that these 3 were all found on eBay together. The 3 that I had, the paperback editions, were all found at the bookstore together. I don't find that to be a coincidence at all. Now, here's the question. I'm not going to ask is it worth reading? But if you're wondering, should you try and go and track these down? I would say potentially, yes. They are a curiosity. They are interesting. They are worth reading. There is definitely some, value in the stories within. Like any anthology, some of the stories I like more, some I like less. And that's just the way it's going to be. I enjoyed a couple of these a lot. Some of the stories less so. If you came across these, I would say, yeah, this is worth picking up. This is worth checking out. But I wouldn't say this is the kind of thing that you really just need to go and search out and find. And, I would never say this is science fiction homework. Like, make sure you get these. You've got to get these. You've got to read these because there's some sort of historical significance or, whatever. I'm glad I got to read them. And I find them just a fascinating concept. Well executed as well. I really wish that I had the opportunity to ask Roger about these, and I didn't. And I regret that. I do. I wish that I remembered that I had those books when I actually had the chance to meet him. But anyway, I don't know if I'm ever going to talk about another book by Roger Elwood. I feel like I've almost talked about Roger Elwood more than I've talked about C.S. Lewis. Almost. I feel like I need to talk a little bit more about C.S. Lewis. I went through his science fiction trilogy, but my favorite book by C.S. Lewis is Till We Have Faces. So if you'd like to hear me talk about Till We Have Faces, I'd love to hear from you. I'd also love to hear from you about what is your favorite anthology. Do you have an anthology that you would recommend to me? that has some sort of unique concept like this, or like the Seven Deadly Sins of science fiction, or my favorite science fiction story, or A Time for Everything, edited by Ben Avery. Look, I'm not very good at plugging my stuff. Okay, I'm doing the shameless plug. That's what I can do. That's what I know. Anyway, shameless plugs aside. Thank you for spending time with me. Thank you for letting me babble on about something that I really enjoyed reading. And until next time, I just want to say Godspeed.